I've done this video once before, but that video went long, and I want to do it again. And I wanted to be concise and straightforward to the point, so it's consumable. I debated on whether to do this video. I even called my wife early in the morning and asked her opinion on it. Lee Stranahan on Faultlines. I like the guy personally. He's had me on the show, Garland, and multiple times. In fact, I even got my start on that show, which is kind of why I guess I thought about it twice. By the same token, this has nothing to do with individuals. This is kind of the Sanders thing, right? Regardless of what Sanders thought of Biden, he need to get rid of that feeling and deal with what is taking place from a human level, meaning on a higher than human level in regards to what your society is going to be and what you want to accomplish in that society. And if you are serious and real about trying to get to the root and trying to deal with those things, honestly, not ensconced in ideology, but in friendships, but honestly, regard those things. I have taken a certain degree of collective feeling about the protests. I love them. I think they are absolutely necessary. When it gets to the point where your political space cannot get what it needs, then the political space needs to be acknowledged as not being a real thing. It's a thought thing. And as a thought thing, human beings are not thought things. Human beings are real things. There's a thought dimension, but we're real things. We have needs that allow human beings to grow and flourish or not grow and flourish. You have a lot of people in your society that are angry, and that are angry for legitimate reasons, even if they can't necessarily put it in real terms. I would make the argument that the issue, the stress, that potential energy is inequality. That's the thing that is digging into you when you give 95% of the income gains under Obama to 1% of the population, and you have 5% fighting over the rest of the spoils, and people are shocked of why are people angry and stressed. The majority of the country, paycheck to paycheck. And then you get this, with 40 million people out of a job, and one segment of the population are dying 3-1. You have a public that is angry. Sanders, I said last week, goes out. Are you going to fight for somebody in the way you're willing to fight for yourself? Many of those people said yes, and they went out into the streets. Now, Floyd gets murdered, and that's the inciting issue. And they burn the police station to the ground in a sense of righteous indignation. You have Washington, D.C. set on fire. Now, you have all sorts of protests that were out in D.C. on the day Trump gave the Rose Garden speech. And a lot of those people got brutalized. Now, Faultlines is talking to Nicole Russo. She's one of the producers that are at our station, and I like her a lot. She's been on our show. She's been very friendly to me when we have our conversations and whatnot. She's invited on Faultlines. She explains what took place, and Lee gives a ludicrous response. Obscene, absurd, comically shallow, and it's a Herculean task of making the obscene somehow acceptable. And it doesn't work. It's a paltry argument that is inconsistent even within on its own terms. It's like if you watch a comic book show and there is a loophole. Well, there's a loophole in this, and the logic that is trying to be used in order to try to make this argument. It doesn't work. It doesn't work on multiple fronts. And as I thought about this, I became more brutal in my assessment of this because I realized in real terms what it is trying to allow and what it's trying to allow for ideological reasons. For ideological reasons. Because the argument just doesn't work in realistic terms. And what it's trying to accept again is the obscene. A takedown of that response that Faultlines made on these protests, especially from the standpoint of the violence that was visited on protesters, on press, peacefully standing there in Lafayette Square as they ran, attacked, beat, tear gassed those people who were there. The defense of violence against protesters by one Lee Stranahan. Welcome to the Soapbox. My name is Jamal Thomas. This is the Progressive Soapbox. Guys, if you dig this content, please like, share, subscribe. You can always support PayPal Patron. This content is brought to you by you, and I appreciate you the opportunity to allow me to do it. Now, I'm going to be swift with this. The last one went far too long. I just wanted to be around 10, 15 minutes. I'm going to let you hear Nicole Russo. This is her talking about being a press agent at Lafayette Square. Let's hear what she's saying.
Armored trucks that had pulled up, and people were beginning to get maced. So I went over to try to get some footage, and all of a sudden, I mean, completely out of the blue, hundreds of police. I honestly think it could have been 200
people.
cops.
All right, y'all, let's take a look.
A bunch of different agencies just are advancing, running on the protesters. They've got riot gear on, shields up, batons out. Meanwhile, military police are assembling on the inside of the Lafayette Park fence. So again, this is, a couple hundred feet from the White House, right across the park from the White House. The military police are banging their batons on the metal fences. The police start tear gassing people, or excuse me, they don't start with tear gas. They start with macing people directly in the eyes. I'm trying to get footage of this, and at some point, the police line gets up to where I am and tells me to move back. And I hold out my press badge, and I'm verbally saying as loud as I can to try to be heard, I'm pressed. And they continue yelling, move back, move back. And then the military police shoot what I think was a grenade of these rubber pellets at me. I'm hit at some point. I don't know when all the hits happen, but I'm hit at some point in there on my hip, on my leg, on my back. These are huge raised, bruised welts that are turning all kinds of colors this morning. And then at some point, a few seconds, I think, later, a policeman in riot gear pushes me down using his massive shield, pushes me down, and a couple of cops trample me before a protester helps me up, scoops me up, yelling, get up, get up, get up, because there's another, essentially just endless lines of cops behind them, including the park police on horseback. This continues for some time, I guess, looking back now at the timelines. They continue to push us back, as we know now, to clear the area for.
Now, you heard her point. I mean, she goes and explains, the attacks and everything else. The welts that these things are metal balls. This woman worked as a use of force committee. She resigns. These are the welts. Or for that matter, these. They may say non-lethal, but that doesn't necessarily mean it doesn't tear, rip, and injure, or take out eyes, or for that matter, the tear gas potentially could kill. Those things are treated as non-lethal. All right, you heard her point. Now, what do you think somebody is going to respond to this? Especially if you could see the video of what took place in the Rose Garden as Trump did that. What do you think? What do you think Lee's response was? Let's hear the clip. Let's hear Lee. And I'm going to make the point on why this is so off the rails, but let's hear Lee first.
And so I'm sorry that happened to you. But on the other hand, I've been out there protesting as well. So I've been out there when I did my Vigil for Assange thing a year and a half ago or so. Maybe it was I forget when I did it, last summer, I guess. And I was out there with a sign. Now, I was in Lafayette Park, and I was there, basically all day right after the show for a couple weeks. And periodically, the police would clear Lafayette Park. And for instance, if the president had been walking out for whatever reason, they absolutely would have cleared the park. They would push people back. And when they asked me and everybody else to leave, I did what they said. And I was protesting, and I'm a member of the press. Sometimes I would go from the White House, press briefing room outside. But when the police tell you to leave an area, do you think that's a lawful order? And because again, I was protesting, member of the press, everything else. But when the police say you need to clear the park, I didn't argue with them. I didn't resist. And even if I just said, you know what, I'm just going to sit here and keep protesting. I'm peaceful. I'm not sure that is peaceful. I'm not sure that disobeying a lawful order, and I don't think being a member of the press makes any difference. I got a press pass, it didn't make any difference. And nothing would have made any difference. They told me to leave. And if I hadn't, there would have been consequences. So how's that different here? And I mean, should I have just stayed and seen what had happened? Because I think I would have gotten in trouble.
Well, I'm hoping, Lee, that you've watched the footage, because I think this is a bit of a different situation. First of all,
that's an astonishing perspective. Like, oh man, that's a heady perspective. That's a heady perspective. That needs to be unpacked. I'm sorry, Lee, I love you to death. That needs to be unpacked. That's a problematic perspective to take, because you need to accept the consequences, the logical human consequences of what you are basically saying here, as opposed to what she's saying. First, not all protests are the same. Full stop. There's some protests that are not contentious at all. There's some protests where the cops will march you from point A to point B. So there's no value in just saying, hey, the cops would tell us to go from here to there. There was no contentious. There was nothing where people were riled up and you had tens and tens of thousands of people. That wasn't necessarily take place at the Julian Assange areas. As opposed to this, somebody gets killed, it's heated, people are angry, they're pissed off, and you get millions of people around the world. I guarantee you that is not any way similar to what you had. So this notion that your protest is somehow indicative of other protests doesn't have any value. The second part to that, to make that case that a person who is sitting there, peaceful, you use the term yourself, and say peaceful, and Orwellian invert peaceful into not being peaceful because you are disobeying an officer, despite the fact that in real world terms, you're just sitting there. What you're trying to do is trying to add a feature of law, something that is not real, to explain something within real world flat reality terms. An individual who's sitting there is literally just sitting there. Now, you're justifying, based on the lowest common denominator of that argument, maximum justice for basically anything, and it's legitimized. Meaning, there will be consequences, yes, but should that consequences be maximum justice over the tiniest bit of infraction? That person annoys me because that person is sitting there. Are there other means to which to accomplish your objectives? And does rational, moral, non-belligerent action, when those actions are more legitimate than the maximum justice? I hope you understand what I'm saying by basically saying you were to some degree responsible for whatever the cops did, whether the cops were belligerent, whether the cops were right in their actions or not. You were responsible because you defied the law, whatever that law was. Curfew at 4 p.m. Why? Because we don't want people on the streets. According to Lee, he would go in his house. And then you ask the question, well, wait a minute. What's protest mean in the United States? What is the First Amendment of the United States if they can make a law that intentionally forces people to break the law in order to protest? Your opinion is grotesque in this and misses the entire point of any level of movements and any level of how the government does things in order to stop these protests. They hate these things. These things are going outside of the political apparatus, and they can't stand that. They can't control that. They want that energy infused into politics. And when it's outside of politics, things start to change. Things start to get chaotic. They want that energy back here. I understand that you're uncomfortable with that. But the mechanisms of state wants to crush those things, and so it makes curfew at 5 o'clock. It makes curfew at 6 o'clock. It does things to try to intentionally criminalize those situations. Now, your response is maximum justice becomes an okay consequence because of it. I'm saying that is utterly obscene. The notion that they can impart justice. This is not a Judge Dredd movie where cops can do whatever they want. And basically you just say as a society, that's okay because that person asked for it because they were sitting there when the cop wanted that person to move. Accept the logical human consequences of your point. That's obscene. Basically, you are telling me, you're telling me that this situation right here is basically, okay, this is fair game.
We have an ambulance for him. We have EMT on scene. He is wicked!
Now, this meets all of your criteria. The gentleman, peaceful, bugging the cop. The cop could have walked around him. The cop could have arrested him and took him away. But they decided to dispense maximum justice and knock the guy down. 75-year-old man. Now, your argument is that man was being violent. I'm saying that's ludicrous. That's an inversion of reality when you can look at that. They said in their report, they lied and said the guy tripped and fell. Why? Because they understood that what they did was wrong and the injuries to that man almost killed that man. The idea that because he bugged the cop, that the cop could dispense maximum justice, and your response to that is, well, there were going to be consequences, the guy got what it came to him. I'm saying it legitimizes the very reason that the people are out there protesting. And you who sit there and say, to some degree, that this is okay, or that the guy was asking for it, I'm saying that's obscene. Your society should not be okay with that. Flanked by cops, full of riot gear, batons, weapons, guns, a tank in the back of them, snipers around. There's no threat. Justify that. You can't. The only way you can do it is to invert reality and say that that guy, by virtue of him standing there, was displaying violence. There is nonviolent protests where the point of that protest is for people to be arrested and filling up the jails and whatnot. Those are mechanisms in which movements engage the state. They're not fighting the state, and they're not coming with knives and guns and weapons and whatnot. They're throwing their bodies on the line. And in this situation, those peaceful people who are standing there would accept arrest, or for that matter, would accept dispersion. Him talking to the cop doesn't legitimize him being beaten in that way and pushed. You are trying to legitimize that. You can't justify that at all, nor should your society accept it. On the other point to this, if there is a legitimate, rational, reasonable way to obtain an objective, then it doesn't justify the government from using maximum justice in attaining those goals. If you can use peaceful means, because again, the state and the government has no purpose, has no point, legitimately, rationally, morally, or legally, to dispense force whenever it wants to dispense force. That should not be allowed in your society. And I don't give a shit if you're white, black, gay, straight, whatever. Just as a society itself, those are things that we should not necessarily want cops out there doing. That's shameful. And that takes place everywhere. I can show you another video where they hit the guy in the head and then they said the guy charged him with assault. Again, that's shameful. And every video like that that's produced legitimizes the entire reason that these people are out there protesting in the first place. The last point that I want to make, or just as an addendum to that, they knew that he was going to be out there. They decided to go out there for other reasons than just moving the crowd. Now, to explain what I mean by that, I need to find it. So this was Washington, D.C. Let me see if I can find the picture. Washington, D.C. was up in flames. Literally. Washington, D.C. went up in flames. Now, as Washington, D.C. went up in flames, Donald Trump sat in a bunker. Now, that's why they've been calling Donald Trump Bunker Bitch, because basically, when this was taking place, he was cowering in a bunker somewhere. So what do you do if your name is Donald Trump, you want to be a tough guy? You come out and you make an unhinged speech, basically declaring war on the American public.
That is why I am taking immediate presidential action to stop the violence and restore security and safety in America. I am mobilizing all available federal resources, civilian and military, to stop the rioting and looting, to end the destruction and arson, and to protect the rights of law-abiding Americans, including your Second Amendment rights. Therefore, the following measures are going into effect immediately. First, we are ending the riots and lawlessness that has spread throughout our country. We will end it now. Today, I have strongly recommended to every governor to deploy the National Guard in sufficient numbers that we dominate the streets. Mayors and governors must establish an overwhelming law enforcement presence until the violence has been quelled. If a city or state refuses to take the actions that are necessary to defend the life and property of their residents, then I will deploy the United States military and quickly solve the problem.
Donald Trump declaring he will put U.S. military on home soil to potentially shoot American protesters. Now, to get a perspective of what was taking place on the ground, where Lee is basically saying, well, hey, if you're standing there, you should be, potentially asking for it. Here's the catch. At no point did they tell those people to move. Donald Trump wanted to make a statement. This is how this was covered in Australian press.
You're outside the White House where Donald Trump is about to speak. It's getting a bit tense.
Yeah, absolutely, guys. We've just had to run about a block as police moved in. We've been fired at with rubber bullets. My cameraman has been hit. We've also seen tear gas being used. Here we go. They're moving through again. This is exactly what it looks like. Exactly what it looks like. We're just staying safely.
Oh, whoa.
At any point, did they tell those people to move? No. They came out to make a point. They could have walked out. They could have charged people, pulled them to the side for arrests. They didn't do that. They had a very specific interest in making a point. Donald Trump looked like an asshole. The reporting made the point that instead of putting military out, they were given this thing of, hey, show a strong position and walk to the garden, clear those people out. Bill Barr comes out, does a looking. Michelle, our producer, calls and says, Bill Barr's out here. This this looks a little bad. And at that point, all hell broke loose. Peaceful protesters standing there, all hell broke loose. Tear gas, clubs, etc., etc. There was no point in which it was asked, could you guys please move? No, that point was made through brute, unnecessary force. Now, just so we're very clear, the people scattered. If your objective was to clear the area, they were clearing the area. Now, the catch becomes, do you have to do that by running into the crowd like maniacs swinging batons? And if you are indeed running into the crowd like maniacs swinging batons, what is your objective? Is your objective to subdue, to get people to leave, to take people to jail? Or is your objective to do exactly what you're doing? Run into the crowd swinging the baton like a maniac to make a strong man position of, I am not a bunker bitch. I am going to walk to the Rose Garden. Again, they knew for hours that this was going to take place. Trump could have cleared those people at any point. He chose to do this, and he chose to do it on television. That's why the argument is BS, because there's politics wrapped around in why he did what he did, and you didn't have to do what he did. And on top of he didn't have to do what he did, from the larger point of how people protest and how the cops do their job, unnecessary force is unnecessary by definition. I don't have any issue with a cop trying to protect his life. The problem becomes that guy hit his head, that guy tripped and fell. This other guy assaulted me despite the fact that I beat the shit out that guy. I am getting to the root of this notion of why is it okay for cops to dispense maximum justice even or just because that guy gets annoyed. And for somebody to justify what is obscene, that a person's life matters less when that person trespasses on something that bugs that officer or that bugs that state, despite the fact that person might not be a threat. I'm sorry, that's a disturbing position to me. And when you're looking at what took place in real terms, the cops ran out like maniacs. There was no point in time in which to kind of settle that. But there's something wrong with the logic of even where we've gone with this. Julian Assange, the person that he mentioned in his protests, because he cares so much about Julian Assange. Julian Assange is a press person. He's a journalist. He is a journalist that Lee is protesting for because he is being persecuted for publishing truth. Truth, like a reporter who is there trying to get videotape and footage of the state doing what the state is doing. My point is this. If you are really indeed backing Julian Assange, it is a weird position to me to basically say that the press shouldn't be able to cover the mechanisms of the state. The state, given any opportunity, would want the press not to cover it. But you're basically saying at any point in time when the government says, I don't want you to look at this and cover this, then they should say, okay. That defeats the entire point of Julian Assange. The entire reason they run after him is because he's publishing truth, things that the government would rather not be exposed. How are you simultaneously saying that the press should not be able to cover the mechanisms of the state, the behavior of the state, especially when the state is behaving ghastly, that the press, the media, should somehow look away, while simultaneously using that you were at a protest of a man that never looked away and was being persecuted for not looking away? How weird is that position? Certainly you see the contradiction there. How are you backing Assange and his search for truth and publishing truth while simultaneously saying that journalists and reporters who are trying to cover gross truth that is taking place in real time, history in the making, that's wrong? And that the government, who has every reason in the world to not want what it's doing to be publicized, that the press should just say, okay. That destroys and criminalizes press freedom. You realize that. And that basically undermines, basically guts any notion of support for Assange. Because that's literally what he does. I'll end this here. And I've belabored the point long enough. I just want to make the point that that argument doesn't fly at all. Like, share, subscribe. Thanks all.